In the cold hills of Aargau, Switzerland, where the air hangs heavy with frost and silence, stands a gray fortress they called Habsburg Castle. Not the kind of castle you'd read about in fairy tales. No gleaming towers or golden halls, just a stone carcass against the wind, cold, stubborn, and waiting. Inside those walls, long before anyone whispered their name in fear or reverence, lived a family of minor lords, poor in land but rich in hunger. They were men who looked out from their battlements and saw not kingdoms, but possession. The kind of ambition that festers quiet, generation after generation, until it begins to feel like destiny. A flickering candle burns inside an empty hall. Its flame bends and trembles, like it already knows the weight of the centuries to come. That light, small, almost pitiful, would one day illuminate the faces of emperors, kings, and brides offered to strangers for land and gold. The Habsburgs weren't born to rule the world. They built their empire in whispers, not with war cries, but with wedding vows. Their strength wasn't in soldiers, it was in blood. And that same blood, once worshipped as pure, would become their undoing, a poison passed from cradle to cradle. Here, in this damp cradle of stone, begins a story not of power, but of inheritance. The humankind that stains everything it touches. A story of what happens when families chase eternity so hard, they forget how to be human. From these cold Swiss hills, a dynasty was born that would one day rot beneath its own crown, its beauty twisted, its purity cursed. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of that first candle's flame, flickering, warning, waiting. Where are you watching from tonight? The mountains, the city, somewhere quiet and haunted. Subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline and stay with me. The light's fading, and this bloodline's just beginning to burn. His name was Rudolf of Habsburg, clever, cautious, and devout. Not a warrior king born from conquest, but a tactician born from survival. In the year 1273, the world changed for him with the Pope's blessing, a parchment sealed with crimson wax, naming him King of the Romans. But titles, like crowns, can weigh heavier than steel. Rudolf had no army to defend his throne, no treasure to buy loyalty. Only alliances, whispered promises, and daughters who would soon become currency in a quiet war fought at the dinner table, not the battlefield. He wasn't born into power, he courted it. Every handshake was a transaction, every marriage a weapon. While other kings bled their people dry with wars, Rudolf learned that blood could conquer without spilling a drop. They called it divine favor, that the church saw God's will in his rise. But Rudolf knew better. It wasn't heaven that crowned him, it was calculation. His faith was not in saints or relics, but in the lineage he was building, one betrothal at a time. Each daughter promised away, each vow spoken under candlelight, was another brick in the empire's foundation, an empire that would soon grow too big, too proud, and too inbred to stand on its own. In that quiet gamble, Rudolf bought the future of his family, but at the cost of its soul. He believed his bloodline would rule forever, yet every promise he made chained them tighter to their own undoing. From the shadows of Habsburg Castle, the first threads of a dynastic web began to stretch across Europe. What started as strategy would soon turn into sickness. Marriages between cousins, uncles, nieces, all in the name of keeping power pure. And like all gambles built on greed, this one came due. Not in Rudolf's lifetime, but centuries later, when the empire began to crumble under the weight of its own blood. In the decades after Rudolf's gamble, the name Habsburg began to creep across the maps of Europe, slow, deliberate, like ivy across a tombstone. They had learned their lesson well, that the mightiest sword in the world was a wedding ring. Where other dynasties sent sons to die on the battlefield, the Habsburgs sent daughters in silk, fragile, trembling, yet far deadlier than any army. Each marriage they arranged wasn't a union of hearts, but of territories. Each vow whispered beneath a cathedral's arch carried the weight of kingdoms, borders, and bloodlines. When Rudolf's descendants married into Austria, they did more than exchange vows. They buried their roots deep in the most fertile dynastic soil in Europe, a land rich in power, politics, and promise. That single alliance bound the Habsburgs to a nation that would one day become the heart of their empire. And like roots that grow too deep, it would feed them and entrap them. Rudolf's grandson stood before an Austrian altar, hands trembling as the priest spoke blessings. But beneath the sanctity, something else stirred, an ambition dressed in lace and roses. The union promised stability, but behind every smile was a silent transaction. Love was the currency. Legacy was the prize. From that single ceremony, the Habsburgs began their quiet conquest, building a dynasty not on bloodshed, but on bloodlines. It was the first thread of a web that would one day strangle Europe itself. Generations later, when their sons and daughters could trace their lineage only by mirrors, historians would look back to this moment, this first union, and whisper that this was when the curse was conceived, the day they mistook God's blessing for genetic destiny. The Habsburgs thought they were binding nations together, but in truth, they were sealing their own fate. One kiss, one vow, one drop of blood at a time. By the 1400s, the daughters of the Habsburg bloodline had become currency. Traded across borders like rare porcelain, wrapped in silk and duty, they were sent away to foreign courts with one sacred command: to marry power and to birth empire. Each girl carried with her the weight of dynasty, the expectations of fathers who saw children not as blessings, but as bargains. Behind the jeweled crowns and wedding veils, their lives were written long before their vows were spoken. Every smile at the altar was rehearsed, every tear a quiet rebellion that no one dared notice. They called them the Habsburg Angels, but there was nothing angelic about what they endured. These women were bridges between kingdoms, sacrifices in lace, and vessels of diplomacy. Their bodies carried treaties, their children, the future of Europe. And with each union, the bloodline folded in tighter, cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, all in the name of keeping the throne pure. Let others wage war, the saying went. You, happy Austria, marry. But the happiness belonged only to the map, not to the women who paid its price. Each daughter left home with a promise that she'd strengthen the family. But what she truly carried was a sickness, not of the body yet, but of legacy. A sickness that would one day turn divine blood into something rotted and fragile. By the end of that century, the Habsburgs had woven their web so wide that it circled the continent, Spain, Burgundy, Austria, Hungary, and beyond. And every strand of that web was spun from a woman's sacrifice. Their faces forgotten, their names erased, yet their wombs built an empire destined to collapse beneath its own blood. Tell me, how many generations does it take before a family forgets its own mercy? Stay with me. Subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline, where the candles still burn for those who never had a choice. It is 1477, and Europe is trembling. A warlord's daughter now stands at the crossroads of empires. Mary, the sole heir to Burgundy's gold, its lands and its pride, carries more than a crown. She carries the temptation of every power-hungry man in Christendom, and one of them waits in the shadows. A prince from the rising house of Habsburg, Maximilian of Austria. He has no vast army, no royal treasure, only a name that whispers of ambition. When his eyes meet Mary's across the candlelit hall, it is not romance that passes between them, but calculation. That single union changes everything. When Mary marries Maximilian, the Habsburgs inherit Burgundy, one of the richest realms in Europe. Gold from Flanders, silk from Italy, trade routes stretching across the continent, all now flow into their grasp. The match that began as a funeral arrangement becomes the birth of an empire, and behind the marble and tapestries, the same old sickness begins to stir, the belief that marriage, not mercy, conquers kingdoms. Power traded hands with kisses, not swords, and every kiss left a stain that no crown could hide. The Habsburgs' reach now slithers westward, their web tightening around the throat of Europe. What began as a small Swiss dynasty has now become something vast, something inevitable, a machine built on lineage, welded by weddings. But fate is cruel. A few years later, Mary's horse throws her to the ground. Her neck snaps, her reign ends in silence. Her blood stains the earth that made the Habsburgs rich. And from that blood rises a new generation, one that will wear her dowry like a noose. From love came empire, from empire came rot. It is the early 1500s, and Europe is stitched together not by peace, but by marriage contracts sealed in Latin ink. Across this quiet empire of chapels and coronations, the Habsburg name coils its way toward destiny. At its center stands a man, Philip the Handsome, golden hair, courtly charm, eyes that promised heaven. To the world, he was beauty wrapped in silk. To his father, he was a weapon. His task, to wed Juana of Castile, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Spain's most powerful rulers, the monarchs who conquered Granada and sent Columbus into the unknown. The union would be perfect, Austria's rising blood fused with Spain's divine lineage. Two empires joined in the name of God and inheritance. Scene shifts. Torches flicker in the Spanish courtyard as Philip steps off his horse. Juana watches him from the balcony, her hands trembling with something between love and dread. What began as duty ignited into obsession. Juana, fiery, emotional, and fragile, fell into love so deep it burned her sanity. Philip, proud and cold, began to drift. Rumors whispered of his infidelities, of nights with other women, of laughter that mocked his wife's tears. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But madness is rarely born from nowhere. It is planted, watered by betrayal, isolation, and the slow suffocation of a royal cage. Yet she refused to let him go. For months she traveled with his coffin, sleeping beside it, whispering his name as courtiers wept and priests crossed themselves. It was not love anymore. It was the curse of the Habsburg bond. A family so desperate to bind kingdoms, they bound their own hearts until they broke. From this tragic union was born Charles, the boy who would inherit half the known world. Spain, Austria, Burgundy, the Americas, all beneath one bloodline. But within that blood lay the first clear mark of decay. A mind haunted by faith, a jaw too thick, a lineage turning inward. The Habsburg dream was complete and cursed. A family that conquered the earth, yet could not master its own reflection. They said the sun never set on the empire of Charles V, but for the man who ruled it, daylight was a curse, a light too bright to hide the shadows in his own blood. Born from a union between Philip the Handsome and Juana of Castile, Charles carried within him the stitched-together legacy of 1,000 arranged marriages. Every drop of his blood whispered of power, but also of repetition. The same faces, the same features, folded over themselves for generations. A dynasty trying to breed eternity, and instead, summoning its own undoing. At 20, he inherited the world, Spain, Austria, Burgundy, Naples, the new world beyond the sea. So much land, so many souls, yet his hands shook when he signed his name, because he knew power was not a gift, it was an inheritance of ghosts. He was the grandson of Mad Juana, the son of a hollow marriage, the product of a family that married itself to keep the crown pure, and pure became poisonous. As his empire grew, so did his faith in divine destiny. He saw himself as God's emperor, a ruler chosen to unite Christendom. But beneath the golden armor, he coughed blood into linen, his body bending under the weight of ancestry. His tongue swelled, his jaw stiffened, the first whispers of what history would call the Habsburg curse. Charles's empire devoured continents. Yet within his palaces, silence festered. The laughter of children was rare. The eyes of his heirs looked too familiar. Inbreeding was no longer a rumor. It was policy. To keep their blood divine, they closed every door until the air inside grew foul with repetition. By the time Charles laid down his crown, the empire spanned half the earth. But his mind was heavy with guilt. He retired to a monastery, surrounded not by courtiers, but by the echo of his family's curse. The same jaws, the same madness, the same loneliness, passed from cradle to coffin like an heirloom. The sun may have never set on his empire, but for the House of Habsburg, the shadows never left. By the mid-1500s, the House of Habsburg stood above all others. Their banners hung from the Alps to the Andes, their seals stamped on more land than any mortal should ever claim. Priests called them God's chosen bloodline, anointed by heaven, protected by faith. But faith, like family, can be corrupted, and the Habsburgs mistook divine favor for divine right. They believed their strength lay not in armies or ideas, but in the purity of their blood. So they began to close the circle. Cousins wed cousins, uncles took nieces as brides, each marriage justified by whispers of holiness, each child born with the weight of generations folded inside their bones. Cut to a candlelit wedding feast. Two young nobles sit side by side, both pale, their profiles nearly identical. Laughter echoes hollowly, glasses clink, but the air feels wrong, heavy. They called it dynastic preservation, a way to keep their empire unbroken. But what they were truly preserving was decay. Every generation the blood grew thicker, slower, more fragile. Eyes sunken, jaws elongated, tongues heavy, the faces of angels beginning to twist into something tragic. Behind palace walls, servants began to whisper. They saw the way royal infants struggled to breathe, how the queens grew weaker with every birth, how madness became an heirloom passed through marriage beds instead of swords. It was no longer a family, it was a closed system, a human labyrinth with no fresh air, no escape. The curse was never supernatural. It was scientific inevitability, centuries before science had a name for it. The Habsburgs believed they were guarding a sacred flame, but they were feeding it their own flesh. In the glow of candlelight, the truth was impossible to deny. Each union that promised power brought them closer to ruin. Each generation looked a little more like a reflection staring back from a cracked mirror, familiar, distorted, doomed. They thought they were perfecting the divine, but what they were really doing was breeding the curse of their own making. In the grand halls of the Habsburg Empire, art was more than beauty. It was survival. By the late 1500s, the family that ruled half the world had begun to rot behind velvet curtains. Yet the world would never know it because painters were forbidden to tell the truth. Every portrait had one command whispered before the brush met the canvas: hide the deformities. The Habsburgs, now prisoners of their own bloodline, demanded perfection. Their jaws had grown long and heavy, their lips slack, their skin pale as candle wax. Yet in the eyes of the court, this was not deformity. It was divine distinction. They told the artists, paint him as noble, not ill. Paint the jaw as strength, not curse. And so, generation after generation, the brush became a tool of deception, stretching faces, softening chins, turning weakness into worship. In oil and pigment, the sickness was gilded. Frailty became holiness. Inbreeding became destiny. The truth was buried beneath varnish and prayer, but the truth has a way of bleeding through. Look closely at those portraits, the long Habsburg chin, the drooping eyes, the swollen tongue barely hidden behind closed lips. Behind the saintly expressions, there is a tremor, a quiet cry of generations collapsing under their own lineage. In these paintings, we see more than royal pride. We see the symmetry of tragedy. A family so obsessed with appearing chosen by God that they could not see they were painting their own extinction. And so, history remembers them in gold, while their bones, beneath the marble, tell a story of slow, sacred decay. It begins again with a wedding. The same ritual that once built an empire now tolls like a funeral hymn. The words are unchanged: for power, for empire, for blood. But the echo that follows no longer sounds like destiny. It sounds like warning. The Habsburgs have come full circle. What began in a modest Swiss castle, with ambition, piety, and the promise of eternity, now ends in a hall of ghosts. Every union meant to strengthen them has instead folded the blood tighter, denser, poisoned by repetition. The candlelight dances across the faces of the wedding guests, every one of them carrying the same jawline, the same hollow eyes. It's not a family anymore. It's a reflection. The same face staring back, generation after generation. This isn't romance. It's ritual. A tradition kept alive not by love, but by fear. The terror of losing divine right. Each bell that rings is a plea to heaven. Keep us chosen. Keep us pure. But heaven, by now, has gone silent. The empire that once stretched across oceans now trembles beneath the weight of its own blood. Its heirs are sickly, its queens barren, its kings childlike and broken. The walls of the palace seem to know it. Their echoes are soft, almost sorrowful, as if the stones themselves are remembering better days, when purity had not yet become poison. Soon, this echo will fade completely, ending with Charles II, the last Habsburg of Spain, whose body will bear the full weight of centuries of inbreeding. The once mighty bloodline will dissolve not with war, but with a whisper, a final breath from a family that tried to outlive mortality and became its own warning instead. The wedding bell's echo fades, leaving behind only silence, and a name that once ruled the world. Tell me, watchers of the Underbelly, do you believe a curse can be born from love too closely kept? If this story haunts you as it should, subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline, where every family secret eventually rings its last bell.